Good morning, and it is that. It's 2:37 a.m. I'm traveling from Seattle, Washington, where I live, of course, over to my daughter and son-in-law's house in Middleton, Idaho, in the celebration of the birth that my daughter gave back, a month ago or so, to Micah Joel. Two incredible Old Testament figures, prophetic voices calling for justice and renewal. We could use a few of those prophetic voices in this day and age, and you have to forgive me. I need to eat here a little bit before I get back on the road. But it's amazing how just driving under the starry sky that you get out in here, that you never see in the city, can clear your mind and your heart. And my mind has been consumed with, as it is for everybody else, forgive me for eating and talking, but consumed with the death of George Floyd and the inherent injustice that represents, and the continuing core racial divide that is in this country. As a white person, I have mostly wanted to engage other white people, particularly pastoral friends and other people who follow the name of Christ. And am amazed. I don't know why I say that, but really am amazed at the responses. They come down in several directions. For some, it was a belief that the world is about ready to go to hell in a handbasket. That what we're seeing on the streets of our cities is somehow a sign that Jesus is about to return again, because the world's going to collapse under the weight of its sin. There's plenty of that. The interesting thing is, in my tradition, it's sad because it's not the birth of our tradition, but in my tradition, sin is all personal. It's about sex or behavioral patterns or lack of character issues, which are critical, but with a blindness towards the very social justice issues that is at the heart of the struggle. And the idea that, and the real sad thing is I spoke with one pastor this week, and he was really talking about the goodness of God being able to help us walk through this period until we get out of it, meaning going to heaven. I thought, wow, what a sad hope. Not going to heaven's the eternal life that is going to be breaking in upon the earth, that we are going to be very much a part of, and the renewal of all things is a great hope. It's my own hope, actually. But that somehow is a ticket to ride some kind of eternal airplane out of here while the world burns is just, it's not the gospel. It's not what the early church believed or taught. It's not what attracted slaves and attracted the poor. What attracted the poor is the belief that there was in fact a good God, and justice was going to be breathed upon the earth, and that the day of shalom, the day of God making everything right, would come. That's why Luke didn't spiritualize the issue. He says, blessed are you if you're poor financially, because you're going to be rich, and woe to you who are rich now. You have your reward. This thing's going to turn around. That was an incredible statement, incredible hope. My tradition is born in that, and yet turns a total blind eye. Not in the sense of caring. I don't know any more loving people than the people in my tradition, often. I also know a lot of resentful, horrible, don't mishear that, but the truth is, character transformation, which really does take the work of the Spirit of God in us, when it's compelled by love, especially a thankful spirit, when God has not only saved you from something horrible, does produce a thankfulness and a generosity that you just don't find anywhere else. It's fun to watch when it happens, and I see it. We have a gentleman in our church and a lady, Chuck and Alice, that are just symbols of that. And there are many others, but it's just generous. There's nothing in their spirit. There's nothing they wouldn't give to financially, personally, emotionally. So I don't mean to disparage my tradition in that sense. There's so many good things that come from it. The belief that everything that we do is a gift to God, and therefore, if I'm going to be a nurse, I'm doing it for God. If I'm going to work in the financial management, it makes a difference in the way I treat the employees. It makes a difference in the wages I pay. Those things that I find in my tradition on an interpersonal level that often has great integrity, and I don't necessarily see it everywhere else. And so it's not like I'm hopeless, but boy, when it comes to social justice issues, there is so much defensiveness to be found. So on the one hand, you have this perspective. It's not my battle. My battle is to get as many people to heaven as I can, and certainly treat people well. And if I can make something right, I'm going to do it if it's in my sphere. But beyond that, it's not my battle. So that's the one. And so for those who are in that tradition, they don't focus on, though they grieve with George, they don't focus on that, and certainly not the social justice issue inside that. They focus on the fact that there are riots, which in and of itself is sad, because I'll get to that. But they focus on that, and it's an unconscious, dismissive sense of I don't need to deal with the world and all of its junk. That's tragic. That's part of the problem. And then I run into the thing where so many people who are white had hoped the election of a African American president would put to rest this whole issue. Yeah, I mean, if you're going to elect an African American president, it must say something about us, and it does. Honestly, it really does. But it's like there was a real transformation that came out of the 60s. The world changed. It came to a consensus. And I was born before that consensus. I never experienced Jim Crow. I wasn't old enough to see it. But I was old enough to witness my own prejudice, and have all my life. That's a different story. I won't bother you with that detail here. But I remember my dad talking about Negroes, etc. I just remember the sensitivities that I became aware of by the Holy Spirit, of just how ingrained, how I pick up these habits, and I saw black people as the other. Not always negative, just the other. And it's how you in a power struggle, it's how a police officer gets control and then is afraid to let go of the control, and you never hear the cry of the other, because you don't treat them, don't think of them in personal terms. And that can be deeply rooted prejudice. That can be a manifestation of a job that you've come to hate, and a hardness of spirit over a community that may be surrounded by race, may have little to do with race, I don't know. But it's the 4/5 of a person kind of thing that just, yeah. And so the other reaction I get from my friends that I talk with who are white is, and they're pointing to again back to the issue of the riots, and say, look at that, and as if we should be offended by that. And when you don't immediately jump on it and say that is of equal, there's a rage that comes from that, and it's a defensive rage, and underneath everything there's a sense of grievance. I'm grieved. I have my own problems, so why are you forcing me to worry about your world when I have my own grievance? To see these people who are destroying our cities. There's so much wrong with that at so many levels. So let's unpack a couple of them. First of all, it's comparing apples with oranges. There is nobody who thinks the rioting that's gone on in the country in the last few days, and may go on for a while yet, is good. It's an evil. There's no question about that. But it is oranges and apples, and at several levels. Here's the first level it is. What happened to George is an iconic statement, and an appropriate one. It's the right one, of a whole systemic original sin in the country, of a dialogue that we need to have that white people don't want to have again. Quite frankly, I don't think African Americans want to have it. Everybody is tired of the hassle, just want to make it go away. Why does it keep happening? So there's a sense of that on everybody, and there's, I suppose, a sense of appropriateness in that because of the consensus we came to. But for white people, there's a real refusal to recognize the depth and breadth and length of that original sin. How it still frames, still holds not only individual worldviews, sometimes prejudicial ones, but more importantly, it creates barriers of distance of the other. And so when you confuse those two things, when you try to say, I'm grieved, what's the other you're talking about? It's African Americans. Number one, we're going to come to that in a moment, that's not accurate. Number two, that's confusing apples with oranges. It's a few, maybe mostly African Americans, on the edge of a passion of the many who are doing exactly what they should be doing, and doing it exceedingly well for the most part, and honorably, and have been joined by brown persons, other persons of color, and by white people, mostly young adults who have surrounded the issue. And it's more than protesting. It's actually a communal grieving, and I think something really good is about to be born. I'll get into that a little later. But this defensive spirit that tries to equate the two is a way of keeping the other, and it's a way of trying to make oranges and oranges because there's a personal grievance there, or whatever its source is, and I think there are many. No need to unpack that tonight. But there's this personal need to push it away. And you do that by blaming the very people who really are the ones that we should grieve with. And shut up as white people and listen and learn. The second thing that I think is the recognition that what is obvious and accurate, that the looting and the rioting is so wrong, is not a national issue. And it's not going to be. It could become that if either the Democratic Party, or more likely in this case, the president, who thrives on chaos, sometimes creatively, sometimes horribly. In this area, it's horrible almost always. So he could accidentally, or perhaps even on purpose for political reasons, amplify the thing and make it worse. But it's not a national issue. The racial issue is. It's profound, and we need to deal with this next level of it, this original. We need to go back to the original sin and unpack it in new ways. I'll get to that in a moment. But it's going to be a local conversation, because that's what it is. It's happening in local stores, on local streets, between police and between a certain minority, extreme minority. And so when those communities come together after it's all calmed down, there will be an assessment, there will be research. People will try to figure out, where did this thing come from? How much of that did come out of the community's anger? How much of that was actually fabricated by others who had an agenda? I think one of the things that the president's gotten right is pointing towards Antifa. Everything I've seen of Antifa is horrid. And the mayors of the cities, D.C. and Atlanta and others, have confirmed that the records the police are finding is that most of the people they're arresting are out of state. One of the things that I like, and I know this is anathema to Democrats, but I like an attorney general who I think will pursue this issue, because that is the role of the federal government. If there is a cross-state issue, that becomes federal, and that's where the federal government can use its authority to bring justice, and it should. And so this is a local issue, and it needs to be handled at the local level, because it's not a national issue, and pray God that it doesn't become. It could, but I pray God that it doesn't. But it will be if we try to equate these two issues, if we inflame it that way. It doesn't need to be. It should be a part of the resolution. And here's the third reason it should be local, and that is it really is I grew up with the 60s riots. That was not the same thing we're seeing here. It could become that, but it's not the same thing. 60 people were dead in LA. Whole sections of Compton were buried, and that was just a very, very different kind of that so quickly became, if it ever was, something far more than a protest. What I see in Seattle, what I saw the other night, I so much wanted to go down and join, and would have. I wouldn't have got in front of it. I would have stood in the middle and the back and prayed. Would have kept my mouth shut, especially as a white man, especially as a preacher of a church that has kept quiet. But I would have liked to have been present, but I couldn't. I'm coming over here to Idaho and a new baby, and it's just not appropriate. Anyway, so what I saw in Seattle was maybe 1,000 people, young adults, brown, black, white, lots of different coloration, saying please to officers, and a lot of anger, yes, but it was passion. It was more than a protesting. It was that, and it was healthy and it was good, but it was a communal grieving. This has got to stop kind of thing. And then I saw maybe 4 cars and 20 people involved in the looting, 25, maybe 50. To confuse those and equate those, especially if outside groups are agitating and the evidence is there that they're organizing it, that is morally wrong as well. That's horribly wrong. Because the problem is then we point the finger at what legitimately should be condemned, but at the local level, and not in this context, because you're equating two things that really probably when it's done and the local communities have sifted through it, I think they'll discover it's not one and the same. It's an extreme small minority that what really was happening is something that everybody praises, right and left, and should have happened. And finally, it was happening largely to African American communities. That wasn't true in Seattle. It was downtown, but in Minneapolis and other areas, the destruction comes in those same communities. So I just want to say to my white friends, back off. Listen and pray. Walk in reverence instead of accusation, as though we have a grief that even comes close to the multi-generational griefs of the great-great-great-great-grandpas whose families were destroyed, and then the great-great-great-grandpas who had new land but didn't have the economic means to produce from it and with it, and ended up going to the banks, who then put them in indentured servitude under their previous landlords. And though they, quote, owned it, they really didn't. They weren't empowered. The money structures kept the same. And then to the KKK and the whole Jim Crow thing that moved, and the denial of voting rights through all kinds of things that African Americans had to jump through, that you really had to have a master's degree to know some of this stuff. Most white people wouldn't even get close to it. And each generation, the parents would say, live with this thing. Be like Christ. Be patient. A new day is coming. And then you have just the history of my parents, and finally the consensus that we should be, through the sacrifice made by Martin Luther King and the African American Episcopal, Methodist, and Baptist churches, when the white churches of America were silent, except for some of the liberal, social justice oriented ones. Mine was silent. We weren't even at the table. And so to equate that with the fact that 4 police cars were burned in my city and I'm supposed to be grieved, that makes me angry. And it's sad. And it's deflection. It's not the intent maybe, but that's what it is. So, what's emerging from this? And I say to my pastoral friends, I say this to my fellow white Christians, is a new synthesis, not a consensus that we came to. Because there was a radical change in the 60s. The legal barriers really have fallen. It doesn't mean that the system is good. It doesn't mean that, there are still so many wide gaps. I was in a session with Ron Sims, I think it was. Can't remember. Anyways, King County executive, and he mentioned that King County in Seattle, where I live, is the most racially segregated county in the United States, and he had the evidence, the demographics to prove it. Now, we perceive ourselves as the most open and liberal and accepting, and on the surface we are. In Seattle, you have every culture mixed, and that is a change. You have African Americans and whites that are truly in the workplace friends, sometimes beyond that. Not in the church. The church, by and large, is still a very divided, segregated place. But he says, we, by the demographics, black people are still in their area, white people in their area, poor white people are in their area. And there is real margins. I saw that vividly when I was in another city in the United States recently. And I guess you get used to it in your own city, so you don't hear the person saying, "Let me breathe." You don't see. They become 4/5 of a person, if you will. So there are so many gaps. If my son growing up did some stupid things, God knows he did, the authorities would simply say, "He's a kid. Let's redirect him." The chances, though, if he was African American, that he'd end up in juvie, didn't have dad, is so much greater. The stats are real, and they're significant in education, in going into the juvenile system, in housing access, in income access, the ability to start businesses, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. The gaps are amazing, and the disparity is getting greater. If employment goes down to 4% for the nation, you can bet the African American is still up around 7 to 15%. Now, most recently, and I think you have to give some credit to the president. Now, Democrats are going to hate this, but I really do believe the policies of this administration have begun to address some of the opportunity issues. Because I think private industry can do some things, and the new zonings, and then getting some social justice in the criminal system. Those are things I think you have to give this president. I just hate the system where we can't applaud anything in the man. We have to hate everything on the one side, and on the other side, on my side, because I'm a Republican. It's man, the guy does no wrong when there are several things that he does that are horribly wrong. Much of what he says, 20, 30, 40% of it is ungodly, it's demeaning, it's in your face, it's all about power. You see that this week. He thinks in terms of power. The whole American First thing, that is not what God created this country to be. We are a blessed country. But we are blessed for a reason that we have forgotten. We are blessed to be a blessing. And we're not blessed because it's not manifest destiny that it's supposed to be a white country. What's manifest, and what I believe God blesses is this is supposed to be a color-filled country. The one place where no matter where you are, whatever liberty you've been denied, you can come to America. And the degree to which we are denying that and making policies that inhibit that, We are opposing God in that, and we will pay a price. What the president did going to last night and the disbursement of the those who were just protesting in order to do whatever it was, that's blasphemy. It's a deeply profound misuse of the authority of the office. It goes back into the history of our freedom. The government doesn't have the right to do that and misuse sacred space. So, as a Republican, I want to be in a position to tell my president, and he's my president, whom in some ways I'm very proud of, who really is blowing up a lot of the corruption and a lot of the power of the government that just inhibits and gets in the way, and it's not creative, but in other ways is doing some things that are anathema to the Bible. I want to speak to both sides of that. I have to as a Christian. Well, here's the real issue. We have a consensus of a colorblind country that we've made some progress on in the public square. Precious little process beyond that. But in bringing down barriers, we've made some serious progress. Legal progress, etc. But a colorblind society is based on a negative principle. It's based on the idea that we don't let the prejudice of looking upon color be the barrier it's been. That's fundamentally a negative way of saying it. It's like the Ten Commandments, thou shalt not. It has its role, it has its purpose because it's corrective. But that's not the goal. And what I see in these kids demonstrating, saying enough is enough, if Republicans and Democrats, if young and old, if white and black will just love one another, we will take care of the violent part of that. We'll do it together. We love enough, a new kind of culture is going to be born, and it's going to be a colorful, color-filled America. So I tell my pastoral friends, God isn't about saving us as individuals so we go off to some kind of heaven that's out there. It's not the way the early church thought. Heaven is more like what we think of in science fiction in those days. They thought of the principalities of the air of being just around you. They didn't have a view of the cosmos. They didn't have the telescopes we have. They didn't think the world is round. So heaven was the same space, unseen, where God used to rule. And so when Jesus says, your kingdom come, your will be done on earth as it is in heaven, there was no imagining that we were saved to go someplace else. The imagining is the day of shalom, the day of renewal, the day of resurrection is coming, and God's kingdom, like his unseen around us where God still rules, is going to break in up on us here. I'm not without hope. It may get worse before it gets better. We'll love our way through this. Church, wake up. White people, the only person you need to have empathy in this situation for is George. And we need to see ourselves in that white cop instead of dismissing him as evil. What is it that allows a man who is a peace officer to not see and hear a person made in the imago Dei, the image of God? What is it in me, in you, that makes us do that? That lets systems of justice and systems of economics and systems go on forever, where we do not see the impact upon certain communities, certain groups. We don't see the homeless as people. We see them as however we view them, etc., etc., etc. I'm that white cop. That's where I need to listen and ask God, how can we, for that cop and other cops who carry a burden like nobody else does, they're at the center of the battle How do we return them to being peace officers? How do we give them the skill sets to disarm and de-escalate issues? How do we stand with them and beside them in the risks they're taking instead of spitting in their face sometimes? How do we at the same time hold them accountable when they don't see and hear the very people they're supposed to serve? And how do we do that with one another? Tell you how we don't do it, by pointing at the other, saying, but see what they do. If you can't call that injustice, don't talk to me about the other. That's a bunch of bull. It misses the point. Of course it's wrong, but it's an issue that will be dealt with. The real issue is the one these kids have their finger on. Yeah. And that's where Jesus is going to be. That's where you're going to be, and that's where I'm going to be. God bless you.